Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining Delivering Powerful Feedback, the 3 components for confident, impactful assessment feedback practices. We're just going to give everybody a couple of minutes. As I see people joining, we're just going to give them a couple of minutes to get on before we start the show. And just to let you know, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, the group chat, if you just go ahead and share something there with me, or send me a message directly, I'll be here. I'm the moderator, I'm Jag, and we will get Anissa ready to go and start presenting just a few. We're just waiting for a couple of more people to join. Again, just to demonstrate where the group chat is, I'm just going to send everyone a message. Just be able to send everyone a message so they're able to kind of go ahead and see where that group chat is. We'll also have a Q&A feature that's going to be available to you. And as you see that, you're able to kind of go ahead, kind of pick a way to go. And, at the same time, if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to kind of send them over. And I'm happy to present them to Anissa to answer. Anyways, I think we're at that time where we're ready to get going. Again, thank you very much for joining Delivering Powerful Feedback by us here at DTEC. The three components for confident, impactful assessments and feedback practices. We're here having the conversation kind of led by Anissa Zarek, who is a psychologist and a coach and our resident expert here at DTEC. Anissa, over to you.
All right, thank you, Jag. I'm really excited and welcome to DTEC's very first live webinar. As Jag just mentioned, we are focusing on delivering impactful feedback and really going above and beyond just the report so that you can really go and have added value and really great impact. The session will be focused in 2 parts. We'll start with part 1, which is really adding value above and beyond, like I just said. And in part 1, what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing recommendations based on both my personal experience and the literature review. My focus today will be really delivering you hands-on information that you can use and integrate in your feedback. So we'll talk about hands-on case studies using both the Hogan reports, the Hogan assessments, and also the DTEC reports. But I really want to highlight that regardless of the assessments you're using, the information that we'll be giving in this session will be useful across the board with different assessments. So if you have specific questions about that, you can definitely chat and ask questions about that. Now, also, one thing that I want to add is that delivering feedback, I'll be using the literature review, but I'll also be using the 13 years of experience in delivering feedback that I've had in being a consultant. So I've been a consultant since 2006, and if we do the math and calculations at this point, I've probably delivered over a couple of thousand feedbacks, both to hiring managers, leaders of all level. So this is what I'm going to share with you in terms of my own experience, but also the best practices in literature and what the research is telling us. And as Jag mentioned, we'll reserve a particular period at the end for a Q&A, and you are welcome to ask any questions that you might have. When it comes down to it, really there are 3 key factors. We can summarize all the information in 3 key factors that really seem to make the difference. And I'll cut to the chase and present those 3 key factors. And what's really important in making that difference and having impact is going above and beyond just describing the results and making connections. And here I emphasize the making connections with 3 key things: A, or number one, making connections with the respondent's work context. So you want to really personalize that feedback and make links with job implications, right? So if I'm delivering a feedback on Hogan assessment, for example, to a coach, I might emphasize if they have high inquisitive as a score, so meaning they're very curious, they tend to think strategically at a high level, I'll make links with their personal job implications. So I'll talk about how, as a coach, they're probably very good at exploring possibilities, at focusing on coachee's vision, and on bringing new ideas forth, right? And probably being seen as a strategic partner by clients, as opposed to if I'm talking to a manager, well, then I'll give specific implications to that. So number one, you want to make connections with the respondent's work context. Number two, what you want to do is give feedback on macro themes. There can be a lot of information in an assessment report. What you really want to do is be able to synthesize that information for your client and focus on really those key elements. And to do that, obviously, you'll use the context to know what to focus on, but you also make connections between the results to offer macro themes. And finally, number three, which I found over the years is a really key one, and the literature supports that, is really getting your feedback receiver engaged. So you need to connect, number three, not just with the work context, not just the results within themselves, but number three, connecting with the feedback receiver. And a good way of doing this is by asking powerful questions, right? So we'll want to really connect with the participant to get them engaged, receptive to the feedback, and also active in the feedback, and not just passively receiving the information. So let's start with number one, making connections with the job context. So to make connections with the job context, what's really key is understanding the job context. And to do so, ideally what you need to do is, before you even start thinking about the feedback, is you're focusing on a needs analysis. So particularly in a selection context, this is really key. And typically I recommend that you save about 30 minutes to meet with the hiring manager and really do a proper needs analysis where you understand job components so that you really can focus on identifying clear and relevant selection criteria. And as an external consultant, my most impactful feedbacks are the feedbacks where I really understand the context, so I can really help the feedback receiver in making a good hiring decision. In a development context, you want to understand job context really to be able to focus on what's of most practical importance for increased performance within the role or in a future role. That's really key.
Hey, Nisa, I had a question come in from the team here, and they were asking, what is key to cover off in a needs analysis? So what are those specific items that they should be looking for to make sure that they've captured enough information?
Sure, and that's great. And that's really great because we actually have a slide on this. And typically what we want to focus on are three main aspects, right? And we all know that we, in a job analysis or in a needs analysis, we want to know more about the job fit, right? So we'll ask about what are the main tasks, the main responsibilities, what are the main KPIs, how will we assess performance? But we want to go above and beyond just understanding the job, but understanding organizational culture, also the culture fit. Right, so you want to ask questions about that, and you want to ask questions about boss fit. Particularly in a selection context, these aspects could be also important in a development context, but particularly in a selection context. In the boss fit, for instance, if we go to my next slide, here are a few questions, and we'll make these questions available to you after the webinar so that you can use them in your needs analysis. And basically, some of the boss fit questions that you might ask, or if you're doing the needs analysis with the hiring manager, what are three important things to know about, working with you as a boss? Who do you work really well with? What are your expectations? if you're doing the needs analysis with the participant themselves, what are 3 important things to know about working with your boss, right? So that you have a feel of the dynamics between them and the boss, right? I go back to job fit. Obviously, you know about the ones with the main responsibilities, the tasks, the KPIs. I talked about those. Bullet number 3 is one that I really emphasize and ask in all my needs analysis. And this is the challenge question. What are the biggest challenges inherent to this role? And I really emphasize the challenges inherent to the role, not the challenges that you personally feel are difficult in this role, but what comes with this job and what's particularly challenging in this job. And I'll just show you the nuance between the 2 first questions and the third. The 2 first ones, I get more at that job description. So for instance, for my job, a consultant, an organizational psychologist, I might have as a main responsibility or task delivering feedbacks, obviously, facilitating workshops, webinars, certifications. But in terms of challenges, one of the main challenges in my role is being able to relate to clients, right? So this just changes perspective and gets you information that you might not get if you're just asking the first 2 questions. So this one is a key one that I highly recommend. And obviously you've got some in terms of culture fit and in the development context, really important to ask, looking above and beyond just performance today, but where do they want to go? All right. So ideally, you do this needs analysis before the feedback session. In a coaching context, this actually might be integrated in your intake session where you might ask just a few questions more. If you haven't done a needs analysis and you decide to do a feedback, you can also go back to your coaching notes, your intake notes, right? So in a coaching context, if I use an assessment, I'll make sure that I reread those initial intake sessions note, and those are really useful, right? Sometimes you don't have the luxury of doing a needs analysis. At the very least, reserve about 10 minutes at the beginning of your feedback and ask a couple of these questions so that you can make links and you can even use the same words that they're using, but you'll be giving much added value information if you're able to understand the context, even if you haven't done a full-blown needs analysis before the feedback. You can do that as an introductory portion of your feedback. And I always want to say before we even start the feedback,
I'm so sorry. It turns out it looks like the presentation had just froze. Anissa's just exiting the session and she'll be right back. So if you can just, I'm so sorry, bear with us. We'll be back online in very shortly, and we'll get this going again. I apologize, and I'm sure the value that is available in this session will be worth kind of putting up with some of these technical issues. But again, we do apologize. It's technology and these things happen. But again, just a few minutes, we'll be back on board. And while we're getting through this, and yes, again, sorry, the presentation did freeze for a bit. Anissa, again, is just leaving and she'll be joining, closely. However, I really thank everybody for the questions that are coming in. We'll ask some of these towards the end of the session. But as we see slides that are your relative and speak to the items that you're asking about, we'll absolutely go ahead and share them. Welcome back, Anissa.
Thank you. I was booted out of our session, so I'm glad to be back with you guys. And I'm glad to see that people know what the critical incident technique is. So I'm seeing that 100% of people have responded A and B. And Jag, just perhaps if you want to explain if there's any questions that came in or where I should pick up, that would be greatly useful.
Yeah, you know what? I'm actually just going to ask you to go back one slide. And if you could just go back to slide 10 and just kind of restart from there, I think that's the best place to go.
Yeah, well, if you allow, I think slide 10 is where we kind of froze with the poll. So at this point, I see that we've got some poll results. And basically, slide 10 was really just asking you about the critical incident technique. So basically, you should be seeing on my screen, and hopefully you guys are seeing my screen, but you should be able to view the question that was.
I think Anissa's just frozen out again. Again, we apologize for any of these technical, any of these issues. But again, I'm happy to start answering questions on Anissa's behalf. While I think she leaves us and comes back. But a couple of the questions that we had coming in was, if we are, again, having these feedback sessions and we're presenting individuals with their reports, what is the best time to be able to share those reports with an individual before the session? And the best practices that we share really kind of come back from, hey, let's send them the reports just before the feedback session. And the reason we want to send these reports just before this feedback session is we don't want people to look into the reports that require, either for an individual to be certified or, items or to have, a reserved attitude before coming in. And we've got Anissa back. Do we have her back, Anissa? Again, we really do apologize at DTech. It looks like we're having just some small internet issues. But again, sorry, going back to when's the best time to share those reports with your candidates. Again, some of the best practices that we see is we want to give those reports to your candidates just before the feedback session. And the reason we want to do it just before the feedback session is we don't want people to have already read into the reports, made a list of their own objections, or not agree with the reports because the whole delivering of these items, delivering the reports is so critical, especially with the understanding that is taught to you in our certification courses, whether again it's a Hogan report or all those other pieces. One of the questions that had come up, will we share the presentation with you after? Yeah, absolutely. We've captured your email addresses and we will be able to share the presentation with you after. Again, we really do apologize for these technical difficulties, but it seems to be a little bit outside of our control. And we'll kind of go ahead and continue to move forward. So one of the other questions that I've had here is, how do you manage resistance during a feedback session? We'll have Anissa answer that as she gets back. We're also asking, or people were asking, what is the mix in terms of positive and negative feedback or items to share with an individual in the session? Hey, welcome back, Anissa.
All right, good to be back, and hopefully I'm technically stronger at this point. So I've had the team help me out, so hopefully the connection will be stable for the rest of the session. All right, so Jack, do you want to just kind of hint where I should be picking up?
Exactly where you left off. So we're now looking at the question, and you were sharing the results.
Okay, perfect. So that's great. All right. So I will just go back here. And basically what we want to do is use those critical incidents. And the point that I'm trying to make is really remembering that the critical incident technique is a great technique to use in a needs analysis in preparation for feedback, right? And simply just asking, what's a specific example of an outstanding performance by someone in this role, you know, someone that either occupies the role right now or previously has occupied the role, or an example of unacceptable subpar performance, and asking really concrete examples. And we really don't want to focus on the person, but the behaviors, the actions, right? This is a really very behavioral-based method that gets you to get concrete information about what you're looking for in terms of actions and behaviors. So just remember that asking critical incident, using the critical incident technique, particularly with hiring managers, right, in the selection context, but it can be also in a development context. This one I tend to save for the manager of the feedback receiver of the person being assessed, right? So this is a great one to ask that gets you really rich information. So if you can integrate that in your needs analysis, added value definitely. Right? So at this point, the gist of it is you should be understanding the context either with a more rigorous needs analysis that's done before the feedback, or at the very least, a section in your feedback at the beginning of your feedback to explore and ask a few questions to the feedback receiver in terms of context, right? And as you go along, you can, if you feel any more in a question, don't shy away from asking more questions. We'll see shortly when we cover asking questions and powerful questions. One of the main complaints of people after a conversation is that the other person didn't ask enough questions, right? So you can never ask too many questions, but sometimes we fall in the trap during a feedback of just feeling that we need to deliver something, but asking those questions to understand context or asking powerful questions to engage is really the way to go. All right, so now we understand context and we make connections to the context, right, when we deliver that feedback. Next, what we want to do is make connections with key themes, and that's really synthesizing the information, looking at all the information and being able to synthesize that information and highlight key themes, right? And it's really important to remember there's a lot of information that can be overwhelming, and that's a risk of doing feedback with assessments. For instance, with the Hogan, if you're using the entire leadership forecast series, you have 28 main scales generating scores, and you have 105 subscales generating scores, right? So it can be quite overwhelming to have all these scores. With a DTEC senior report, for instance, you're getting 35 different scores. So it's really your job as a feedback giver to be able to synthesize that information and focus on really what's key, right? And identifying main themes can really be useful. If you're using Hogan, for instance, Hogan in the certification has different tools that generates that helps you focus on themes. There's one that I'd like to present to you today. So for all of you who are using the Hogan, sometimes I use as a little bit of a cheat sheet, if you will, the themes that are generated in the Leader Focus Report. So even if I'm not using the Leader Focus Report, I use the structure of the Leader Focus Report, and this can actually work with non-leadership roles. And instead of talking about having different styles of leadership, I focus just on using the word results focused, people focused, you see very process focused, but it gives you macro dimensions, right? And here you can see, for those who know the Hogan, they've combined scales from both the HPI that looks at day-to-day personality and the MPPI that looks at values to generate more macro themes. And actually, we could even add the HDS scales to this, right? So that people leader might be that dutiful derailer that's popping in, and we can even make connections between derailers and the theme that's coming through through that. So that's one idea that you can use if you're using the Hogan. But quite honestly, you can use also maybe some models that you have. For instance, for about 12 years, I've worked at SPB, and they have a talent dictionary. And I often have the talent dictionary when I do an analysis of assessment results, preparing for feedback. And I look at what are the core talents at a more macro level that's coming out of the results, right? And here I've done a mapping for a few of them, right? So, they all have cute names, but for instance, the master organizer, we've linked 3 different scales to this, right? And this is me doing this myself above and beyond, what Hogan might generate. So if you have tools with a dictionary with themes that speak to you, you can use that and kind of map those dimensions out. All right, so let's play around with an actual case study. So here's, let's pretend, this is the profile of Josh, for instance, supervisor of operations, right? So it's just a brief context. But if we look at macro themes, right, we could go scale by scale. And obviously you do want to give information that at the end of the feedback will leave no surprise, right? So basically what I do is I start off with the key themes. I finish off ensuring that anything that might create a reaction when they read the report, I cover in the feedback, but you don't need to actually go through every specific scale. So if we look at this one, and you can use the chat if you will, but what are the macro themes, the main themes that you'd probably want to focus on when you deliver the feedback to Josh, our supervisor of operations? So if anyone wants to use the chat, feel free to use the chat. If not, I'll give away some answers, right? So if we go back, so I'll help you guys out. But if we go back to the patterns of leadership behavior that we saw that were generated from that leader-focused tool at Hogan, we see definitely the people leader and the process leader. So these 2 dimensions are really what we see. And these are macro dimensions, right? So if you notice the yellow part, we have the people leader with the higher interpersonal sensitivity coming out. We see that also altruism is one of the key values in the blue part, the MBPI. And even for those of you who are Hogan trained and certified, you'll notice that the 2 derailers here are moving towards derailers, right? They're patterns of behavior that when they're under stress, their way of dealing with stress is trying to get closer to people by either showing up perfectly or showing up in a very pleasant and trying to please other people, right? So this is, we're all moving towards people, this people-focused theme, right? And you can generate strengths associated to that theme and the areas of vigilance. The same with the process, right? We're seeing prudence. The diligent, again, is about being perfectionistic and sometimes micromanaging, right? And we see for the values, tradition and security that make links with that process and that need for stability and structure, right? So you really are linking up and making bundles that make coherent wholes. And there might be just 2, 3, 4 themes that you're focusing on, as opposed to just delivering feedback on many different scales. All right, so that works beautifully for Hogan. It also works for different assessments, such as the DTEC assessments, right? So if we're looking at this DTEC assessment, this is a senior management report. So for those of you who use the DTEC reports, you'll recognize this. And DTEC has actually made it quite easy for people to look at macro dimensions because they're actually right here on the side, right? So those gray shaded boxes give you macro competencies or macro dimensions linked to the different dimensions and competencies measured. So clearly in this profile, we see that relationships dimensions are lower, right? And the strengths are really coming from the vision block, right? So this is, let's say this is Jane, she's senior manager marketing, And we could picture that she probably had many very successful marketing initiatives due to her conceptual thinking or innovation. Look at all these green bars that are high: conceptual thinking, innovation. She's agile. She's able to, come up with new solutions, adapt to changing clientele, for instance. But she might have burned bridges, right? Or not being as impactful in terms of building relationships, persuading, motivating her team, right? So we see that the people focus, that was the strength in Josh's profile, is really the area of vigilance. So we see probably a profile that is more task focused and even visionary, right? So making those links with those macro competencies. And notice that I didn't even mention all the different scales, but bringing that up to a higher level. All right. Now I'm going to talk to you about, so far we talked about making connections with the context so that the information is personalized and relevant to the job itself, so that they have practical information. Number two, we just saw that you want to make macro themes so that it's more digestible, right? Not overwhelming, but we know where to focus on. That's our executive summary. It's your job to present the executive summary and not just all the detail and not getting bogged down in details of the assessment, right? And that really leads to much richer conversation. And the much richer conversation is making connections with participants. And the key thing to do that, different things, but asking powerful questions is definitely a key element to this, right? So that we'll see that by asking powerful questions, there are different impacts, and asking lots of questions increases. And I want you to go based on your experience of delivering feedback. Asking lots of questions increases learning, likability, persuasion. From your experience, what does it increase most? So go ahead, take a few seconds to respond to that, if you will, and we'll look at what your polling results say. All right, so just a few more seconds for you guys to answer that. All right. So let's look at the results. So I don't know if you guys were able to access the poll. It seems that perhaps the poll is unfortunately not working. So at this point, so there you go. So I will push this back. And we have different response: learning, persuasion, both A and B, both A and C. So, and ABC, so actually it is all three: learning, likability, and persuasion, right? So it increases all three. So there's absolutely no reason not to ask questions, right? Obviously, think of the Socratic method. Questioning really engages the feedback receiver in the conversation. And think about it, when you start talking about a topic, this is when you're really starting to clarify ideas and make links. So you want the person to be talking about their feedback results, or you want the hiring manager to talk about the implications. So ask those questions. It will facilitate learning, particularly important in a development context. It does make you more likable. Asking questions make it seem as you're interested, right? It demonstrates your interest in learning more and being curious about the person. So that increases likability, and it does also increase persuasion, right? So the more you ask questions, right, obviously you want to ask the right questions, but it does increase also your impact, right? So many reasons to ask questions, and I'll give you a few key questions that I asked during my feedback. But the tricky part is, in a feedback, oftentimes we feel time pressure, right? And I would say that this is one of the very biggest lesson learned that I've had over the years that I've been delivering feedback, is really not to let that time pressure keep me from asking questions. And sometimes less is more. So even if I spend less time talking about the feedback and the results, but I've gotten the person engaged, that is a much better feedback than if I covered everything, but I didn't get the person engaged, right? Even if there's time constraint, ensure that you're getting that person engaged, and if need be, they might come back with questions and let that open, but you want to make sure that you're engaging them at all points during that feedback. All right.
Anissa, I just got a question from the team out there. Just going back to, just increasing your likability. So the exact question was, how does it increase likability?
Right. It's a good question, and increases likability, particularly, and there might be different reasons, but one and that I was pointing out to is that increases likability because you're showing interest. You're showing that you're listening to the person, you're showing that you're interested in what they have to say, and it's really a two-way dialogue, right? As opposed to just me delivering and being task focused. So you're really entering in a, you're connecting with the person and you're showing interest. And that's why it's shown, it increases your likability, right? Because it shows that you're interested, that you care, and you want them to talk, right? You want to listen to them. All right, so hopefully that answers the question. And now we'll pursue, and hopefully you guys are seeing my slides. And I'll just review. Jack, could you just confirm that you guys can see the slides?
Sorry, yes, we can see your slides.
All right. All right, well, glad that you guys can see the slides. I'm having a little trouble seeing the slides myself, so I will just... I
have you on 23 of 34.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that, Jag, right? All right, so here, let's move on to the next slide. We should be at 24. And basically, well, I'll just go back to 23. There are different contexts where we want to ask those powerful questions, right? So we want to ask those powerful questions to be able to, first of all, just set objectives, right? So this is basic coaching 101, right? Establishing the contract. So what does the person expect from the feedback? And you want to do that. There are specific questions also that you'll want to ask, in terms of deepening the understanding of different scores, synthesizing that information. So what are the key takeaways? Engaging the person to think about that is what you want to do, right? And then there are key powerful questions that are also questions that are meant to trigger action, right? Set the person in motion, right? And there might be other sessions that are scheduled for that, but you do want to reserve some time to just kind of give a teaser of, getting this person into action. And oftentimes in a feedback, I'll do this by asking, well, what's one small thing that you're inspired to start doing that can make a difference, right? That you could start doing right away, right? So even if they don't have a full development plan, you're sending them out there with a bit of a mission to act on something, right? And then if there's a next session where you are working on a development plan, or sometimes maybe a tool that they reflect on in terms of identifying actions, that's great too. But you leave them on a little bit of a high if you're getting them motivated to act upon the results and not just reflect on them. Notice that I also entered there asking questions about context, right? So if you haven't done your needs analysis, just a reminder, going back to point number 1, you do want to ask questions about that. All right. Any questions? All right, so what I'll do is I'll go through a few questions, but what we'll do is we will make these questions available to you as a tool post after this feedback, after this workshop, so that you'll have a bit of a cheat sheet. And I use this cheat sheet constantly. I review it before giving feedbacks. And I have different questions. Like I said, setting expectations. This one is really key in terms of being able to understand if you're on the same page, right? What do you want to focus on? For instance, in delivering feedback, sometimes when I ask this question in a hiring context, people might just show up and say, well, I want to understand why I didn't get the job. So then I know, whether they're coming up wanting to develop, understanding, what's the tone of the feedback, and regardless of their expectation, it's always key to make it useful, right? How can this feedback be helpful? But understanding what page they're on really helps you set the tone for that feedback. A few questions on the cheat sheet for understanding Hogan scores, right? So HPI is, looking at day-to-day personality. It's a great one to make them think about their strengths. Based on all the strengths that came out of your HPI scores, what is, one strength that you could be using more that could make really a difference, right? That could be used also in a DTEC feedback, right? Understanding more about the context in which a derailer tends to pop up from the HDS, right? And one that I really like about the values is oftentimes, values are aligned. So remember, the MBPI is about what people really value, what they want. HPI is about how they show up. And sometimes there's a disconnect about what they value and what they do in the HPI, right? So when there is that disconnect between the MBPI and the HPI, it could be really, really interesting and powerful to ask them, well, what could you do more? So do more, that's the HPI. What could you do more that would show people that value X is really important to you, right? So someone that has high altruism with low interpersonal sensitivity on the HPI, but high altruism on the MBPI, what could you do more that would demonstrate to people that you do value altruism, right? And get them reflecting on that. A few DTEC questions. One of my favorite one is using in a development context the development levers, right? And asking them questions about that, right? So that what development levers that they could be using for their development, right? And what they can resort to. Finally, wrapping it all up, these are really key questions. So obviously, in an ideal world, you ask all these questions. Realistically, you won't be able to ask all these questions. Do not bypass these questions of synthesizing the information, right? So, I always keep at least one question that focuses on, based on everything that we said, what's the one nugget that you really want to hold on to that's been most valuable to you, right? So really synthesizing that information is really key. All right, so save a question for that. And like I said, then you want to kind of get them into motion and ask them these action questions, right? So, you can get them to think about something bold that they could be doing, right? What's one bold thing that would really make a difference? But you also want to be realistic and focus on what's one small thing that you could start doing right now that you're highly motivated to do so that would really make a difference. So those are the three components that really makes a big difference in preparing your feedback. But I would say that there's one thing that you need to integrate, and this is kind of our bonus element, is that preparation is essential, right? So that you have three components: making connections with context, making connections between the results to have macro themes, and connecting with the candidate by asking powerful questions. To do that, you need to prepare, right? So saving time to prepare a feedback is really best practice, where you want to perhaps really take the time to understand. So reread your coaching notes, read the job description, make sure that you've done that job analysis, that needs analysis, right? So making sure that you go through the motions of understanding context as you prepare. Number two, taking time to really think about those macro themes that you want to focus on, and that should be clear to you before you start the feedback. And number three, sometimes just in preparation, what are really, the top three questions that I want to ask this participant, that I'm motivated to ask this participant. So 3 key themes with a lot realistically, I shouldn't say a lot of preparation, but with basic preparations to do that, right? So for Hogan feedback, if you have experience, I would say you can do this in about, half an hour. That's quite realistic, right? And with a DTEC report, it should be quite similar also in terms of time. So those are the best practices. I'll open it up to questions and the Q&A period.
All right, wonderful. Anissa, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, how does the HPI differ from the strong or event of the MBTI?
Okay, so you've mentioned a few things, right? So obviously, let's focus on, you said the strong, you said the MBTI. I'll focus on MBTI, but obviously all these different assessments have different features. I would say that one of the key things when I compare the MBTI to HPI or the Hogan assessments, right? So that to me, there are 2 different ways of measuring personality, right? So the HPI is on a continuum, right? So you're getting more precise information on where the person is. So if we take sociability, that's the closest to introversion, extroversion on the MBTI, right? On the MBTI, you're either introverted or extroverted, right? So you're kind of put into that box. Whereas in the HPI, you're on a continuum. So you can be in the that midpoint of 50 percentile, 54 percentile. So you're getting a little bit more nuance. And this is one of the key features that I really enjoy in terms of working with the HPI, so that we have nuances about people's scores. So I would say that that's one key thing that would differ between the MBTI and the HPI, right? And, oftentimes I'm not an expert on MBTI. I've got basic training. And I do, when I teach at the university, we do have a module where we look at the MBTI. And the MBTI is also strongly related to preferences. And here, the HPI, we will talk about preferences and values in the MBTI, but we're talking more about reputation and how you show up in the HPI. So I would say that those are 2 distinct elements that I would put out.
All right, thank you for that answer. So I've got another question here. It's, have you ever considered using the feedback session as a strategy for validating test results, that is asking whether they think the results are an accurate representation of their psychological characteristics, and B, as a strategy for asking the job applicant how, in their own opinion, are these results how do these results color the performance of the key competencies for the job? So sorry, long question. I hope you got that. Let me know if you need me to repeat it.
Yeah, maybe just repeat the second question.
So the second portion was, as a strategy for asking a job applicant how, in their opinion, would these results color their performance for these key competencies for the role? So it sounds to me like they're asking how the applicant finds the competencies, I guess, they're being evaluated for the individual that asked me that question. If I butchered it, please send it back to me.
All right. So definitely, I would say that I've definitely used this strategy in terms of validating this results, particularly in a development context. This question seems to be targeting more selection and recruitment context. But I would say that, in a development context, I really use this approach of using the results in an exploratory way, right? So that, really looking at their reaction about the results, what makes sense to them, oftentimes in terms of key questions that I ask them is, what are any surprises that you've had in this results, what resonates less, so that I'm really curious to explore that with them And I really have an exploratory tone that we're using this as a self-awareness. In a development context, I really use the word self-awareness exercise, and that there might be things that either, don't make sense to the person. And that could either, that could be because the tool has its limits. So these are validated tools, rigorous tools, but they do have their limits. So that it might be, that even though people responded like this tend to be like this, in their case, this is not the case, right? And being open about this, right? And sometimes also it could be that they might not be self-aware. So just recently, I delivered a feedback where the person might not have recognized, the person did not recognize themselves. They were open, they showed openness, but it's only after the feedback that they've said, you know what, it's true, I did change, and maybe I was a little surprised at this, but finally, this is me. And over the years, I did change on this respect. And I had a client that is, a true believer of these assessments. But when this person talks about getting their own assessment done for the first time, it took several months before this person, fully recognized themselves on certain areas of vigilance that were harder to accept, right? So that you can, in a development context, you've got the luxury of, showing flexibility and an exploratory mode. But just remember that sometimes, that process will continue even after the feedback. So you can invite your feedback receivers to read their feedbacks, kind of just put it in Outlook. And there's a study that was done with 360 results that shows that after a few months, if you just, reread your 360, it actually helps development, right? I am convinced that this would be also true of assessment, personality-based assessments, right? So, yes, showing curiosity in terms of what seems to be resonating in terms of their results, validating the results with them and what makes most sense to them, right? In a selection context, this could be done delicately. I think it really depends on organizational culture. I find what seems to work best, more than validating the results, is sharing the results and making it useful for them, right? So that they can, I've delivered feedback to people that didn't get the job, that were quite upset about not getting the job. But what made it a success is not necessarily focusing on whether or not this was true of them and validating if they recognize themselves in this, but rather giving them feedback and then exploring how they can use that information and how this is helpful for their own development. And I would say the focus is more on this based on my experience.
All right, great. From the same individual, yes, so it starts with a comment. Yes, it's targeted to selection contacts. He finds that people are getting used to answering traditional behavioral questions. Tell me about a time when, and he's wondering if it would be useful to merge a feedback session with a selection interview by asking how the results on a given scale or a set of scales are coloring their behaviors in a given area or in a given competency.
Right. Well, I think, perhaps where the element, I think you could definitely use the information coming from the tools, the assessment scores, to explore elements in your interview, right? Would I be focusing on, you obtain a low score on this or a high score out of this disdain? I would do it more indirectly, right? Your interviewee is not necessarily an expert on the assessment you're using, and they're also, definitely probably wanting the job. So I would just use it to generate questions. So for instance, I think I'm answering yes to that question, but not directly referencing the test scores, right? Just to generate a question, right? So for instance, for someone who would have a high prudence score on the HPI or a low agility score on the D10, report, I would ask questions that would, kind of explore, tell me about a time where you had to deliver a project or deliver something, under a tight deadline, right? And then exploring that, right? And exploring how did they perform, how did they enjoy that, right? And I'm using the information from the assessment to deliver a more personalized interview that really goes to dig deeper into elements that came out of the assessment. And both the DTEC reports and some of the Hogan selection reports will actually generate questions, interview questions for clients. So hopefully that answers the questions. Any more questions, Jag? We might have time for one last question if there is.
You know what? I'm so sorry. I was talking muted out here. But there is just a couple of other questions. One here is, to what extent can the advice given today be applied to any feedback regardless of the psychometric assessment used?
Yeah. Well, obviously, regardless, so any assessment, I wouldn't go as far as saying, any assessment feedback, I would say personality-based feedbacks, most, I wouldn't see why this would not be relevant in personality-based feedback. Feedbacks that are, obviously, if you're using a cognitive assessment with just one cognitive score, there's just so much, you can do with regards to that one score on a cognitive aptitude assessment, or let's say 2-3 scores that it's generating. So this is mostly about, assessment feedback for personality-based assessments or competency-based assessments, I would say. That would be relevant, right? And if people have questions about specific assessments, obviously we could schedule an appointment for that. But anything that's more competency-based, personality-based, this should do the trick in terms of really generating that conversation. And obviously some of the questions that I presented might be tweaked in terms of how you would ask it to a hiring manager versus how you would ask it to a coachee or a leader in a development program.
Again, with our idea of trying to keep this a 30-minute webinar, and we're kind of hitting that 1 hour mark, I've got, Anissa, one more question for you.
Sure.
If anybody else has any other questions, feel free to send them through. We'll respond to you via email. But, sorry, 2 questions. It's, how do you manage resistance during a feedback? And, just to kind of preface that one is, when do you suggest sharing reports with the candidate?
All right, so great questions. I'll try to make it brief with the 2 minutes that we have left. In terms of resistance, I think that last portion about asking powerful questions is really key. So whenever I see resistance in the feedback, first of all, I want to know more about this. So why are they saying this? What makes them say this? What is it exactly that they don't recognize themselves in? And I make them talk, right? So you're showing interest. You're not just meeting resistance with trying to persuade them, but you're trying to understand more. And I'm also looking at what else in the score might be explaining the resistance and integrating that, right? And then just being able to use that information. And, oftentimes I'll say, I'm not going to try to convince you, but I'll try to explore, why this is not making sense. And then I might just explore that with them, right? So someone that's, might be high on prudence might say, I don't know why they're saying that I might be resistant to change. I propose a lot of changes, but when you make them talk, these are more process-based initiatives that they've generated. So then you can make the nuance and integrate that respectfully in the feedback, and knowing when to let go also, but exploring that. And I find that getting them to talk often opens up a really rich conversation in terms of the resistance. But being able also to, let it go when it needs to and not trying to convince, and exploring it in a respectful manner. Sometimes asking them to explore it also, reflect about it, and giving them time to reflect. Like I said, my client took a few months before they accepted their feedback, but finally they did, and it really changed their career. Finally, reports, I would say that for the feedback receiver, if they've been assessed themselves, so if this is their own assessment, I only deliver the report when I'm with them at the beginning of the feedback session or during the feedback session, never before, because that gives them the time to read the report, disagree with certain aspects of it, and then remember part 2, which is macro, they get into the micro. So you want to keep it macro and you want to deliver. A hiring manager, I might deliver it, 24 hours before, not as impactful in terms of them being personally, invested in the results as the own feedback test taker. So there, I see the time is up. It was a pleasure for me to share this information. Feel free to contact us if there are more questions. It would be a pleasure. Thank you very much.
There we go. Hey, thank you very much, Anissa. And again, on behalf of DTEC, thank you very much for joining. We appreciate your time. We apologize for any of the technical difficulties, and we assure you, when we do this again, we will be over those items. Anyways, thank you again. We look forward to talking to you. And again, any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. You know where to find us. Thanks again. Bye-bye.